Hey fanboys and fangirls, this is Jared from Fanboys Forever, and today we're going to be taking a look at the highly anticipated 112 Collective Mezco Onyx Edition Sovereign Knight Batman, and that's a mouthful. So what do you say we get right into it? First of all, we'll have a look at the packaging. As we can see, we have the standard Mezco label up here for any of their exclusive items. It's very shiny, much like Batman himself. You can see it says Batman Sovereign Knight, which is actually the second Batman in their trilogy of Batman figures that they'll be doing. The next one is, I believe, called Supreme Knight, and the first one was Ascending Knight. On the back, we have some cool artwork of Batman, although it's entirely inaccurate for the actual figure. As you can see here, we have Batman with his no oval logo here, and this is just a recolored picture of the standard Sovereign Knight Batman, which has not been released. This is the, so far, first and only version of Sovereign that has come out. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's inside. So before we get the review started in earnest, it's probably important to talk about the things that this figure is and the things that it isn't. So as soon as this figure was announced, at that time, that there was no talk really of the Batman 89 figure officially getting released. When Mezco first talked about doing the 112 Collective line, if you all remember, they shown a banner of all the different licenses that they had acquired, and one of them was the Batman 89 license. So this got people really excited, but for the longest time, I guess 3 years or so, there was no word whatsoever on a figure getting released. Well, as soon as on the last Batman day that they shown this figure off, everyone sort of assumed that they weren't doing the 89 figure anymore and that this would be the concession piece. Now, I never really made that assumption, but a lot of people did. And so I think a whole lot of folks who pre-ordered this figure had done so thinking that this was going to be the 89 version. And I can get why people may have thought that, but even the initial pictures, it's not like this is a bait and switch or anything. There's some color scheme similarities, of course, and I think there's definitely some homaging going on here, but I wouldn't necessarily call this a straight up 89 Batman by any means. Just one look at the belt, and even one look at the Bat logo, which in the 89 film, it was kind of unique for that film, of course was never used again. But to me, it was always obvious it wasn't supposed to be that. This is a special edition, limited run of Sovereign Knight, which did happen to come out first, making it a little more special in that regard. It is supposed to be shiny. It almost has a liquid sheen to it, if you will. And I think that a whole lot of folks just thought it was supposed to be the 89 Batman, and maybe when they saw initial pictures and a few of the early video reviews, they were a little shocked by the shininess of the figure. And truly it is shiny, but I don't think it's distractingly so. It almost seems like armor, so it works for me. So I just thought I would address that up front. It's not supposed to be an 89 figure, although I do think it's a nice homage in some ways with the color scheme. Matter of fact, it reminds me a little bit more of the Toy Biz figures and the Kenner figures from that era, rather than a perfect 89 Batman, of course.
In the Batcave,
no criminal can hide from Batman.
So, getting right into it, let's go ahead and take a closer look at the actual sculpt work. This is where I always like to start out with Mezco's figures. You can see the lavish amount of detail in Sovereign Knight. Like I said earlier, this is a trilogy of Batman figures that Mezco is doing, and this particular figure represents the midpoint, or Batman at the peak of his powers, I guess you would say, or in the prime of his life. I'd imagine this is Batman when he's 35 or so, maybe 40. And it's kind of him at his best. And so as we turn the figure, we can see that there is, we'll just start from the very top, the head sculpt itself. Mezco has once again outdone themselves. As you will see throughout the review, there's a variety of different head sculpts that are included, and this is the base head sculpt that he comes with in package, and it's probably the most 89-like of all of them. And of course, this is the standard Sovereign Knight head sculpt that you will see in all the different versions. Lots of great sculpting for the mouth. The eyes, ears are nice and pointy, since we don't have to worry about the kind of safety restrictions that a lot of the Mattel figures do. On down, we can see the neck piece is separate. As a matter of fact, if you kind of give it a wiggle, you can see that that piece kind of moves as well, and we'll get into that in articulation a little bit more. And if you look on down, we can get to the chest. Now, as with a lot of the Sovereign Knight figures, or I guess all of them, This piece is going to be just a hard plastic. All the pictures that have been shown of the other versions of Sovereign Knight, it's actually a hard plastic piece. You can almost see that there's kind of a waffle design inside, almost sort of like a mesh underneath. And I think that grounds the symbol a little bit to where it's not so comic booky. It looks just slightly more realistic. As for the actual chest itself, this is where the figure can get a little controversial for some people. Some folks like all of the sort of armor detailing that you'll see on a lot of Mezco Batman figures. I personally like it because I have a lot of standard comic book Batman figures, and now we have a couple of 89 Batman figure options. So I don't really see the problem with them sort of doing their own thing here. And I like that, unlike the Ascending Knight figure, you can see a very clear definition between the kinds of materials being used. It's not just a design thing. You can see that there's actually like a lycra or a spandex bodysuit underneath pieces of armor, which in a way is kind of one of the strongest homages to Batman 89 in my opinion, even though I don't think a lot of people see it like that. The 89 suit was just rubber or armored pieces on a lycra or spandex bodysuit. So to me, I actually like this quite a bit, and when we get into articulation, I think that you'll see a lot of the benefits of it. Moving over to the arms, you can see that the pattern follows over here as well. And to show some of this, I'll get the cape out of the way. You can see that it kind of gets a little more complex over here. And it's a little busy on the sides. Even though I like the concept, it starts to almost look a little bit like striping. And I think anytime in this figure where it starts to look like striping, it can kind of get lost a little bit for what they were trying to do. If you put the arms out, you can see a little bit more of the detail kind of under the arm and to the side over here, and you get some of that striping. Does this remind you of Wolverine? It does me. Moving on down, we will actually see that he's got gauntlets. These are hard plastic pieces, and when we get in articulation, I'll show you the extent of those movements. You can see the gauntlets actually do look quite a bit like an 89 or a Batman Returns Batman. The hands, right now I just have the standard fists on Batman, and I'll of course show you all the different hands. And you can see the, I guess you would call them the scallops on the bottom. The scallops here sort of remind me of the Batman Begins scallops on that gauntlet. For whatever reason, it kind of puts me in mind of that. Moving on down to the belt, you can see I love this design for the belt. It's kind of got something quite unique going on here. This sort of symbol, or sort of almost like a bat's head here in the front, something that I'm not really sure has been done in the comics or any of the movies. So I think that was something quite unique for this figure in this particular vision. I love whenever they give pouches on Batman's belt, and so I was really glad to see that here. On the back, we'll get into this with accessories, but you do have a holster for Batman's grappling gun. And moving around, if Batman's cape doesn't get in the way too much, we can see that the pouches continue. I always really like the pouches on the belt. Moving on down, we can see that on the codpiece, it kind of continues the kind of rubbery look. And on the sides, though, this is probably one of my least favorite parts. We have these sort of strange stripes going down everywhere, and to me it just got too busy here. So that's definitely one drawback right in this area. I think that they broke it up so much to allow for more articulation. Of course, we'll go over that when we get to it. But for now, I just want to say that it sort of detracts visually from the kind of smooth look up here. I think the chest, I think it's practically perfect from the front. I think down here is where they start to lose it with some of the striping. I don't mind this striping though, it's quite nice. And then you have these actually hard plastic sculpted knee pads right here. So these are separate pieces, you can tell from the side, that are plugged in. Then of course the boots are hard plastic separate pieces. The boots, if I had to compare them to another version of Batman, these remind me a little bit of a fusion of the Batman Returns boots and the Batman Begins boots. You can see that it's almost like the 89 sneakers. Of course, Batman was wearing Nikes in the movie, so check that out. That'll be a fun Google image search for later. On the back, you can see there's a wealth of other details with the bat butt, of course, and we have the legs over here. I actually like what they did on the back here better than I do on the front, because they just have these small panels, and I think the stitching is actually pretty good back here. It doesn't look too horrible. Sometimes Mezco can hide some pretty questionable stitching on the back of their figures, but here I think it's pretty decent. The boots are quite nice on the back. You can also see that when we get to the back, before I forget, it is a little busy for my taste back here. It is definitely not a deal breaker. I like it just fine, and it's nowhere near as busy as kind of the inner thigh that we were looking at earlier. But I do think maybe it's just a little much, especially for an area of the suit you probably won't see. But then again, I guess we could say that that was some extra attention to detail on Mezco's part. Moving on down, if we look at the soles of the shoes, we can see that they've got some excellent kind of sneaker imprints here, some great grips. I think Batman is a hardworking guy, and he needs some shoes that's going to stand up to the challenge and kind of help him through the job, so it looks like those definitely have a strong grip. So moving to the back of the head, if I unfold the cape slightly, you can see that this entire neck piece spreads out a little bit, and the back of the head almost has a Dark Knight Rises kind of costume look to it, where Batman had the separate neck piece and then the kind of shoulder area right here. It also reminds me of the Arkham Knight costume where Batman gets his tech suit, so I really like that. And the profile of the head is really nice to the side. I almost get kind of a Neil Adams vibe from it, which I think is what Sovereign Knight should mostly be, kind of your classic Neil Adams prime sort of looking Batman, like all the old key art that we used to see on all the old merchandise in the 90s and in the 80s. So overall, I think the sculpting on this figure is absolutely terrific. So having a look at the cape, I think a lot of people replace the stock cape these days that come with their Mezco Batmans, but I think that this one is actually pretty decent. It is slightly unruly. You can see that holding it down, it does pretty well over the chest. It sets a lot more flush against the body than what the Ascending Knight actually did, and I think that that's a plus. I do think it's a bit full when it goes out like this, but overall it's quite nice. I think it hangs pretty well over the symbol to the sides. You do get a little bit of kind of unevenness right here where it puffs up, but I think that's to be expected when you're dealing with kind of a pleather that's at this scale. I think it's small enough to where that's just going to happen. You can see that there's some pleats that are pre-folded, if you will. You can see that the scallops at the bottom of the cape are very present, of course, as it should be for Batman. On the back, they're there as well. And the cape kind of does this thing where it folds a little bit on the sides. And I like it very much. I think that I won't keep it like this. I think it's a fine look, but I think this particular look worked a lot better for the Ascending Knight Batman. And for this one in particular, I think that it looks quite a bit better if it's back over shoulders. Now, thanks to these pleats, which I think work out marvelously for this figure, you can just get it to lay back naturally into this pose behind the shoulders, and I think it just looks far more dynamic than the other way, which tends to look slightly too bulky. So with this review, I think instead of just showing all the heads in rapid succession, I think that it's more interesting, much like I did in my Joker MDX review, where as we go throughout the review, we'll just switch the heads as we go, and we'll comment on each individually for each section. So for the paint section of the review, when we talk about some of the paint operations and applications on the figure, we're going to take the figure and just pop the head off. Now, it's very easily done, and I just love how little resistance there is, but there is plenty enough to where this thing isn't going anywhere. It's not wobbling. I wish that every action figure that had the switchable head feature, I wish that they could do it this well. This is the best it's ever been for Mezco out of the several Mezco figures I own. I just love switching the heads out on this thing. You never once feel that it's either too tight or too loose, and it's just right. So we'll switch that out. And the first head that I want to talk about is the Bruce Wayne head. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's the same thing that I thought when I first saw it. It's a slight repaint of the Ascending Knight head. And I think that there's still some argument to be made about how much of the sculpt is shared between them, of course, but I really believe that this is, even if it's altered slightly, I think this is a new sculpt we're looking at here. The nose seems to be shaped slightly differently. The chin and the face itself seems fuller slightly. A lot of people were saying that perhaps just the paint job had changed, but I do think there's some new sculpting going on here. I'm sure that they're working off the same base model, but it looks like the same man, only slightly older, and I think that's really terrific. I have never seen an action figure that used the same original design that aged it up in this way. I think it's just an interesting concept, and I think that's why so many people love the idea of Mezco doing an original trilogy of Batman figures. But this section is about paint, so there's no better head to talk about paint than this one, because this is one of the most subtly painted of all. As you can see on the sides, we actually have Batman with some gray in his temples. Now, I don't know about you, but that is exactly how I've always liked Batman to appear. Whether it was Affleck's version or maybe in the first episode of Batman Beyond where we saw Batman kind of graying out with some black. I just think that I buy it more that Batman is the world's greatest detective when he is an older man. And plus, I like Batman to be a little bit older than me because it's a little bit weird when you're older than your heroes. Spider-Man. It's been a little strange. I do think that the hair is also very subtle up here, where they painted in this little kind of almost bang overhang up here, and I think that's really nice. The hair, this kind of subtle wash of kind of the gray and the brown, goes all the way through, and on the back it looks quite nice. As you look at this, it almost looks like that composite image that was going around a few years ago. You know the one I'm talking about, where they did a composite of Adam West, Michael Keaton, George Clooney, Val Kilmer, Robert Lowry, I think was his name from the serials. They did all of those guys together, and I think this looks very similar. Christian Bale, everybody was kind of smushed into the same picture, and I really think they've hit something here that is an amalgam of all the different people who have played Batman over the years, and of course we have some of the comics in there as well. Very nice, very subtle 5 o'clock shadow, very nice skin tones and kind of slight age spots going on. I think the only thing that wasn't intentional for my particular sample is on the nose. There's just a slight little black spot, but then again, my nose has a few slight black spots as well. So I think that we'll say it adds to the realism. How about that? As for the rest of the figure, the paint work is very, very nice on mine, very clean. I have seen pictures on some of the Mezco Facebook groups and things where I've seen some black dots kind of spewing over into the yellow logo, so I was quite fortunate there. I hope that you will be as well. Of course, there's not really paint to speak of. This is just material on the bodysuit. The neck piece and the gauntlets, I suppose, are just cast in this kind of black, shiny plastic. But the belt has some paint work. I really like the gold that they cast it in, and there's also some subtle wash work on the front. I do wish that the wash was a little stronger on the belt when it comes to the grooves here. It seems just slightly plain, and I would almost consider taking some black wash myself and bringing out these details in the pouch. I think it would do the belt a world of. That's on the outside of the cape, but there really isn't a whole lot of paint to speak of. So moving on. Switching out the head again, we can see now that we have the short-eared version. This head probably gets the most flack online of all the ones that I've seen, mostly because they chose to do Batman gritting his teeth here in kind of a different sort of way than I think most people are accustomed to. And I think that the success of this head sculpt really depends on what kind of paint sample that you get with your particular sample. So if you look, we actually have each individual tooth painted, and I think that Mezco, sometimes they do well with this and sometimes they strike out. My teeth are probably painted a little bit better than a lot of them that I've but really overall it's quite nice. I like this head a lot, and as you can see, if you're not using macro photography and he's just on your shelf, then it really does look quite nice, and it just looks like Batman's gritting his teeth. It's only when you start to get super close that it starts to maybe come off as kind of a little chiclet-esque, I guess you would say. As for the rest of the head, it's the standard stuff. Of course, the main difference being that the ears are much shorter here. And we will go ahead and have a look now at some of the articulation. So let's start out with the head. As I said earlier, it's very easy to pop off, But in terms of his limitations of movement, he can look up about that much. He can look down a lot. As for side-to-side movement, you can get a very inquisitive look for Batman here if you so desire, and the head is quite articulated. If you've owned a Mezco before, then you'll be very familiar with most of these articulation points. Let's start out with the ab crunch. Batman can crunch down a little bit. As you can see, you start to get a little bit of a wrinkle here in the fabric. I wouldn't leave him like that. I don't think it's very good for the figure. You can lean him back a little bit. I wouldn't go too far with that either. With these kinds of figures, especially the Mezcos that are wearing kind of the pleather bodysuits, you sort of have to know the limits of what you can do, and that's why they include that big paper that tells you to be careful with every Mezco. Of course, the arms can go all the way out. I don't feel really much of any restriction here. I was actually quite pleased with this. None of this feels like it's in danger or that it's about to snap or anything like that, so that's always good when you can do this freely. Of course, you can go down to the side about that much, but as you can see, it doesn't quite hold there. So you might be able to work with it and get it a little bit closer, but this is about as good as I can do right here. Next, we can actually feel that the shoulders will go up about this far, and you could probably work with it more, but yeah, the more you kind of fold this in over here, you can get it pretty far. But again, I would be very cautious about taking it any further than this. What you're seeing right now is pretty much what you're going to be able to get. So I'll just put that back down. And we can also feel that there's a bicep swivel in here. Again, I would exercise caution with this, as you don't want to mangle this area right here. Now, don't get me wrong, the fabric feels quite stout, but I still would exercise caution. Next, we can feel that I do believe there is a double joint in there. Yes, a double joint, and that's about as far as you're going to be able to take that. Just release that back down. And of course, the wrists can swivel all the way around, and there is a hinge on the wrist, so you can get Batman into the I've got to get him kind of pose, and then the Poison Ivy from Batman and Robin blow a kiss pose. So there we go. As for the gauntlet itself, you can't actually swivel the gauntlet around. I don't really think that there's a joint in there to do that. At least I'm not finding one. Next, we can see down here that there in the chest is also a side-to-side motion. And I'll get them going the other way, and that's how it looks from the other side. There is also a swivel at the joint right there in the middle of the chest and the diaphragm. I can't exactly tell if there's a swivel though for the waist, so I don't really think you'd be able to get much out of it anyway with this figure. Down here we can see that in the midsection, Batman actually has a surprising amount of kick range. I probably wouldn't go much further than this. I think this is about the limit, honestly, but I do believe that this is why they've opted for this bizarre design, because it completely frees up his legs to be able to do all sorts of acrobatic poses. You can also see that there is a thigh swivel right up here. You can get a lot of motion there. I wouldn't flex this too much because you might rip some of the fabric. We have a double knee joint. Looks quite nice, and you can see the separate sculpted portion sticking out there. You can also see that there is no boot cut. It just kind of stays. Going on down, there is a hinge at the ankle, and it rocks side to side slightly. Now, as for how wide of a stance Batman can hold using the ankle pivot, he can actually hold quite a deep stance here. By far, one of the coolest things about this Batman figure, and the many different versions of Sovereign Knight, the other two versions I guess, is this incredible head that you get here that is kind of a battle damage, kind of heat of the moment sort of head, and I just think that this is a thing of beauty. It reminds me of how impressed I was with the MDX battle damage Joker head, and I just think that this is incredible. I think that this is what Mezco does best. I think that the more kind of stuff that they include like this with their figures, the more that they stand out from the competition. Instead of the chiclet teeth, we have some very, very nicely done teeth here. And the blood is so subtle and very nice coming from the side, and especially the kind of reddened eye. It's kind of blackened with the scratch. You can even see where the cowl has been torn. The metal kind of helmet layer underneath has been exposed. On the side, this goes over, and if you turn him this way, it's almost like nothing's wrong. It's just the standard head. You can see that there's a scratch up here to where some of the paint has came off, intentionally, of course. And the ears are the same length as the first head that we looked at. This is an impressive head, and I think that a whole lot of action figure photographers will be posing him with this head in lots of dynamic poses. I saw this head as the most accessory-esque of all the heads, so I thought no better head to introduce the accessory portion of the review with. Now, before I get into any of the actual useful accessories, I do want to show you that we get the cape clips and a little rig to put them in. Apparently, you can use these things to set up Batman's cape in all sorts of interesting ways and do all kinds of crazy stuff with it, but I just don't really want to clip the cape with these things. I just feel like it's going to leave indentions. And does anybody use these? If you do use these, tell me in the comments below. Maybe I'm missing out. Maybe this is something that would be really cool, but, you know, not for me. So, one of the most standard accessories that we're all used to getting with Mezco at this point is the base display stand. You can see that this is the look they're going for with this one. It's kind of funny because Batman's logo does not look like this for this particular release. There's, of course, a posing arm that you can get. You can tighten these screws up in lots of different ways and get him moving in a lot of different and interesting poses. Moving on to the more useful accessories, I want to start out with the most interesting of the hands. And to me, it's got to be this Kryptonite Gauntlet hand. I absolutely love this thing. It's just fantastic. You can see that there's a transparency on the front. It's kind of a knuckle duster, kind of like what Batman used in Dark Knight Strikes Again, and one of the only good parts of the comic. It has a metal bracer around it, and Batman's standard glove. So this is one of the only ones I'll bother to show you actually posed on him separately. The other hands, I'll just show them to you very quickly. You can see that it looks great, particularly with this head, because it almost looks like he's having a very, very harsh battle with maybe a possessed or a enraged Superman at this point. I like it when Batman and Superman are friends rather than enemies, though. So the next hand that I'll show is the one that you can use just for holding some of the different launchers that he includes. You have some open palms you can use for some of the accessories. I like these kind of kung fu grip hands, as I always like to call them. I like to use those in fighting poses. I think they work really well. The other kind of hand that you get is sort of a, hey look, I've got a Batarang kind of hand, where the thumbs are just slightly over the forefinger, and I think you can stuff a Batarang in there and it'll look quite nice. As for the others, you just get duplicates for the other side, like the kung fu hand. And that's pretty much all there is to say about the hands. I'm not one of those guys that spends forever on that. You also get a set of Batarangs that are quite nice, but if you're like me, I usually just keep these things in the little plastic tray they come in for fear of losing them. You also get one what I like to call Super Batarang, and I love that that kind of waffle pattern from the Bat logo is present on the inside of this Batarang. Now, all the accessories that you're going to see, almost all of them share this kind of black and gold color scheme, which has become a tradition for certain variants for this Batman. The next accessory is our Grapnel launcher. I've heard this called a lot of different things, but that seems like the most popular term people use for it. And it has these little lines engraved on the sides, and they're painted in, as you can see. So the other cool thing about this is it comes with two different implements that you can stick in. Here is just the little actual Grapnel Claw itself. You can see that there's just a little hole up there up top, and you just push that in. Voila! The other thing that you can use is this little guy. He actually has an actual rope that you can unroll. I think it goes a good little distance. Then you would plug this in. But I don't really want to unroll this just yet. I don't know about you, but I usually keep that stuff kind of bound up like that. So after working with it for a minute, You can see here he is with the launcher. It looks good. It's very nicely proportioned to the figure. It's not too large, not too small, and I think it looks nice. Next accessory we'll be looking at is Batman's little sonic disruptor gun, and those gold highlights like we saw in the grapnel gun continue with this. You can also see that this detaches, and you can just have this separate. And on the side you actually have a hole, so there are a couple of different ways to store it. As for the grapnel gun, before I store it on his belt, I would probably take this piece off, just because these are really pointy and they actually feel pretty fragile to me, like they would be very easily broken. So in order to avoid that, take that out. Just take the grapnel gun since it's in there. It has kind of a nice hold on both sides. It's so good, in fact, you can shake it all around this way. It's not coming out, but it takes a little bit of working to kind of finagle it into that spot. The last accessory that we'll be taking a look at is this really cool little bat drone piece. And I have Batman out here so that you can see a pretty distinct size comparison here. This drone reminds me a whole lot of the one that flies around that you can control in the Telltale game. And if anybody's played those, you know that the drone is kind of a big part of that game. This is a really, really interesting piece. I'm not sure if I just really didn't see it very much in some of the initial promo pictures, but it's not really something I expected. It's got some excellent paint work all along it. You can see the turbines on both sides that kind of keeps the drone flying, if you will. There's even some great kind of detail here. It almost looks like Thanos' shirt from Infinity War. Am I the only one seeing that here? You can also see that there's some terrific sculpting in the actual piece itself, and there's even some wash down in here to make sure that the turbines stand out. Alright, so let's do some size comparisons, and that will be with his predecessor, the Ascending Knight Batman. Of course, the Ascending Knight Batman is the one that features more the first appearance Batman head. The scales line up nearly perfectly. The only thing is, of course, the ears are longer for our first appearance kind of Ascending Knight Batman. You can see that the faces are a good match for one another, but there is a very much a kind of a pinker hue, more of a, I guess, a reddish hue to the skin over here, and over here we have more of a basic skin tone. I do like more of just the basic skin tone. It's not quite as reddened. So to show just a slight comparison between the two Bruce Wayne heads, we can see that on the left we have the new Onyx version, and on the right we have the old Ascending Knight version. You can see that there does seem to be a slight sculpt difference. I think it's more than deco. And if we have a little look-see here, overall I like the more neutral kind of look over here and the more full look. This always looks slightly narrow to me and a little cartoony. So I do think this one borders more on the kind of realism that I'm looking for, but that's just personal opinion. So, in case you're wondering, between the two different versions of Batman and the Batman trilogy that Mezco's done so far, there is full head compatibility if you want to switch it out. So, let's say if you want to use the head from the Ascending Knight Batman, you can just take it right here, and we'll just pop it on. You can see that it goes on, but unfortunately, it appears the connection is a little loose. It's on there, and it's not going anywhere, but you can see that it's kind of very just kind of sitting on there. But just for display purposes, I think it looks good and it sets really well, so there really isn't an issue with that. So yes, the heads are interchangeable. Alright, another size comparison that I think that a whole lot of folks will be interested in seeing is the MDX Joker and Onyx Batman comparison. So I really love the scale here because they size out almost perfectly. Taking any kind of pose for their head-to-head, you're going to get a perfect eye-level stare down. Next up, we'll mix things up slightly with the Batman Beyond Mezco figure. And appropriately, Terry McGinnis, Batman Beyond, is slightly shorter than Bruce. Here we have a close-up of the two. Although they're not from the same era, I think that the kind of techie bits on Batman Beyond kind of make him a nice match for this Batman, actually, so they would actually look quite good in a display together. Next up, let's compare the size with one of the Mattel Multiverse figures. And here I pop the Walmart exclusive Batfleck head on the armored Batman. Next up, for those that are curious, we have the NECA 89 Batman, and we're just going to put them side by side. As you can see, the NECA Batman stands slightly taller, so you could probably fudge that to where they look pretty similar in terms of height. And just because it's funny, we have the Dark Knight Returns Batman from the Batman animated series line from DC Direct or DC Collectibles, whatever they call themselves these days. And last but not least, just because I think it's funny, we have the Mezco Popeye with his Mezco Batman brethren. I get such a kick out of this Mezco Popeye, and I actually think that they look really cool together. I know there's probably not many circumstances where you're going to be putting Batman and Popeye together, maybe for some kind of incredible team-up. Popeye is very appropriately much smaller than Batman, but in both figures the detail shows through. So a few closing thoughts on the Onyx Edition Batman from Mezco. I think that this is a superb figure, but it is unfortunate for the folks that can't get a hold of it. I do think that this figure will age very well. I think it will stand the test of time. I realize that Mezco now has announced an 89 Batman figure, and it looks fantastic. But I'm glad that they did, because if they hadn't have before this thing dropped, I think it would have given people a false impression that this was supposed to be perhaps their take on 89. And like I said, as long as you can divorce yourself from that and kind of get over the idea that this is supposed to be some kind of Keaton Batman, then once you do that, I think you're going to see this figure for what it is. Packed to the hilt version of Batman that has more accessories than what the standard version will come with. He's got this incredible shiny onyx black deco. The materials are very durable, very nicely done, and I think that any Batman fan is going to be absolutely delighted to have this figure in their collection. So go ahead, take the plunge. I don't think you're going to regret it. And until next time, guys, take care. God bless.